The year was 1881, and the world for Caleb Blackwood had shrunk to the size of a dusty stable loft. The town of Redemption Creek was a hard place, carved from the unforgiving soil of the territories with an axe and a prayer, but mostly an axe. It clung to the edge of the Great Plains like a burr on a wolf's pelt, bristling and wary. For Caleb, it was less a home than a place to endure. At 16, he possessed the quiet, haunted eyes of a man twice his age, a testament to the fever that had claimed his parents on the westward trail 2 years prior, leaving him stranded in a world that had little use for an orphan with nothing to his name but a threadbare blanket and the clothes on his back. He survived on the periphery, a ghost in the town's bustling, coarse life. He mucked out stalls for the livery owner, Mr. Donovan, a man whose kindness was measured in pennies and grunts. He chopped wood, fetched water, and did whatever thankless task was offered, all for the privilege of sleeping in the hayloft, where the scent of horse and dry grass was the only constant comfort he knew. The townsfolk saw him but rarely acknowledged him. He was a piece of the scenery, like a loose shutter or a stray dog. This invisibility was both a curse and a shield. It kept him isolated, a prisoner in a cell of silence, but it also kept him safe from the town's more pointed cruelties, the judgments and suspicions that swirled like dust devils in the main street. Caleb's loneliness was a physical thing, a weight on his shoulders that made him stoop, and a chill in his bones that had nothing to do with the wind that howled down from the mountains. He carried his grief not like a memory, but like a second skin he could never shed. He moved through his days with a practiced economy of motion, his face a stoic mask that betrayed none of the turmoil within. He watched, he listened, and he learned that survival depended on making oneself small, on expecting nothing and therefore never being disappointed. His only solace was found in the land that stretched beyond the town's last ragged building. He would slip away when his chores were done, not for adventure, but for the profound silence of the prairie. It was a landscape that mirrored his own soul, vast, empty, yet possessed of a stark and brutal beauty. He would check the simple snares he set for rabbits, not for sport, but for the rare taste of meat to supplement the stale bread he could afford. He understood the land's language, the shift in the wind that promised rain, the call of a hawk that meant life and death were circling overhead. Out here, he was not an orphan or a charity case. He was just a creature, as much a part of the world as the sagebrush and the stones. It was on one of these solitary excursions, miles from the judgment of Redemption Creek, that his world tilted on its axis. The sun was a low, molten coin in the west, casting long, distorted shadows across the plains. He was kneeling by a small creek, washing the dust from his face, when he saw her. She was on the far bank, partially hidden by a stand of willows. She was Lakota. That much was clear from her beaded deerskin dress and the 2 long braids of hair as black as a raven's wing. She couldn't have been much younger than him, and she was utterly absorbed in studying a small purple wildflower, her fingers tracing its delicate petals with a reverence he understood. Caleb froze. The people of Redemption Creek spoke of the Lakota with a mixture of fear and contempt, painting them as savages, a threat to be managed or eliminated. But Caleb, who had never known anything but harshness from his own kind, held no such prejudice. He saw only a girl, alone and quiet, finding a moment of peace in the wilderness just as he did. There was a stillness about her, a sense of belonging to the land that he could only ever envy. He stayed hidden, not wanting to frighten her, content to simply watch, an unseen witness to a moment of quiet grace. The peace was shattered by a sound that started as a low rumble and quickly grew into a thundering roar. From the direction of the town, 5 riders came cresting a low rise, their horses at a full, reckless gallop. Caleb recognized them instantly, a handful of prospectors, flush with drink and arrogance, men who treated the world as their personal playground. They were racing, hollering, and whipping their mounts, oblivious to anything but their own brutish sport. And they were heading directly for the willows where the girl stood. Time seemed to slow, to stretch thin like heated glass. The girl, startled by the noise, finally looked up. Her eyes widened, a deer caught in the path of an avalanche. She was frozen, trapped between the creek at her back and the stampeding horses before her. Caleb didn't think. There was no room for calculation, no weighing of risks. The hollow space inside him, the one carved out by loss and loneliness, was suddenly filled with a singular, roaring imperative. He exploded from his hiding place, his lanky frame moving with a desperate speed he didn't know he possessed. He scrambled across the shallow creek, water splashing over his worn boots. He shouted, a raw, wordless sound torn from his throat, but the men were too loud, too drunk, too lost in their own momentum to hear or care. He could feel the ground vibrating, the air thick with the smell of churned earth and horse sweat. He reached her just as the lead horse, a massive bay with wild eyes, was nearly upon them. There was no time to pull her clear. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He threw his body into hers, a solid, desperate shove that sent her stumbling backward, out of the direct path and into the soft mud of the creek bank. He had a fleeting glimpse of her shocked face before the world dissolved into a storm of hooves and fury. The first horse struck him with the force of a battering ram, its chest hitting his side and flinging him to the ground. Then came the others. Pain, sharp and blinding, erupted in his back as a hoof slammed down. Another caught his leg, and he heard a sickening crack that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of his own mind. The world became a chaotic blur of dark shapes, thunderous impacts, and the crushing weight of bone and muscle. He curled instinctively, his arms wrapping around his head, a final, futile act of self-preservation. Then, a final, devastating blow landed on his skull, and the vibrant, painful world went utterly and completely black. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a splintered, painful shard of light in a sea of darkness. Caleb's first sensation was pain, a deep, radiating agony that seemed to emanate from every part of his body. It was a living thing, coiling in his back, screaming in his leg, and throbbing with a dull, relentless rhythm behind his eyes. He tried to move, but the effort sent a fresh wave of fire through him, and he fell back into the depths with a silent gasp. When he surfaced again, it was to the smell of wood smoke and something else, something herbal and clean. He managed to pry his eyelids open. They felt swollen and heavy, like stones. The world swam into a blurry focus. He was not in his loft. He was not in the dirt by the creek. He was lying on a soft bed of furs, enclosed within the circular walls of what he slowly recognized as a Lakota lodge. The light was dim, filtered through the translucent hide of the tipi, and a small, controlled fire glowed in the center, its smoke rising to an opening at the peak. A figure moved into his line of sight. It was the girl. Her face was etched with concern, her dark eyes wide and searching. She saw that he was awake, and a small, relieved sigh escaped her lips. She knelt beside him, holding a shallow wooden bowl that steamed gently. She said something in a language he did not understand, her voice soft and melodic. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up his throat. He was injured, helpless, and in the camp of the very people his town feared. But then he looked into her eyes and saw no threat, only a profound and gentle gratitude. He remembered the horses, the thunder of their approach, the desperate shove. He had saved her. And now, it seemed, she had saved him. Another figure entered the lodge, his presence so commanding that it seemed to draw all the light and air toward him. He was an older man, his face a magnificent landscape of deep lines and weathered strength. His hair was streaked with gray, and he wore an eagle feather tied into his long braids. His eyes, dark and piercing, held the wisdom of winters and the authority of a leader. He looked at Caleb, and the boy felt as though the man could see every broken piece of him, both inside and out. This had to be her father. This had to be the chief. The man spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. He spoke to the girl, who answered him quietly. Then he turned his gaze back to Caleb. He said a few words in English, his accent thick, but the words clear. "You are safe here." It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered with an undeniable finality. The chief, Chaitan, watched the white boy for a long moment before turning and leaving them, his silhouette blocking the entrance for a brief second before disappearing. The girl, Winona, dipped her fingers into the bowl and brought a cool, soothing paste to his split lip. The simple, tender gesture was more comforting than any words could have been. Caleb closed his eyes, the pain still a roaring fire, but the fear had begun to recede, replaced by a deep, weary confusion. He drifted back into the darkness, but this time it felt less like an abyss and more like a necessary slumber. The days that followed blurred into a painful, feverish haze. Caleb drifted in and out of awareness, his world reduced to the confines of the fur bed. His body was a map of agony. His leg had been splintered with straight, smooth branches and wrapped tightly in soft leather. His ribs screamed with every breath. A wise-faced older woman with knowing hands, an elder named Istas, tended to him constantly. She forced bitter, earthy teas between his lips that dulled the pain and cooled the fire in his blood. She cleaned his wounds with boiled water and herbs, her touch firm but gentle, her presence a silent promise of healing. Winona was his most constant companion. She sat with him for hours, sometimes mending a moccasin, sometimes just watching the fire. In his more lucid moments, she would speak to him. At first, it was in her own tongue, the sounds a soothing river he could not comprehend, but which calmed him nonetheless. Gradually, she began to use the English words she knew, learned from traders and the fraught interactions at the edge of her people's lands. "You, brave," she said one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb managed a weak shake of his head. "Stupid," he rasped, his throat raw. A faint smile touched her lips. "Brave," she insisted. My father says they would have killed me." The weight of that settled on him. He hadn't just saved her from being trampled, he had saved her from the callous disregard of his own people. The shame of it was a bitter taste in his mouth. As his body began its slow, arduous mend, his world expanded. He could sit up, propped against a backrest of woven willow. He could see the life of the camp through the open flap of the lodge. He saw children laughing and chasing dogs, women scraping hides and cooking over open fires, and warriors returning from a hunt, their bearing proud and purposeful. It was a world of connection, of community, a tapestry woven from countless threads of shared purpose and kinship. It was everything his life in Redemption Creek was not. He learned that Winona's name meant firstborn daughter. He told her his was Caleb. He told her about his parents, the fever, the lonely stable loft. He spoke of it in short, clipped sentences, the pain of the telling still raw. She listened without pity, her expression one of deep, shared understanding. She told him of her own loss, a younger brother taken by the coughing sickness 2 winters ago. In the quiet space of that lodge, 2 lonely souls, born to worlds that were supposed to be at war, found a common ground in grief. Chaitan visited every day. He would enter the lodge and simply stand there, observing Caleb with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a powerful statement. He was watching, assessing, gauging the spirit of the boy who had appeared so violently in their lives. One evening, as Caleb was struggling to eat a broth Winona had brought him, the chief finally broke his silence. "The men on the horses," he said, his voice even, "from the town." Caleb nodded, not meeting his gaze. "Prospectors." "They know you?" Chaitan asked. "They know of me," Caleb corrected quietly. "The orphan boy who sleeps in the stables." Chaitan considered this for a long time, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You had nothing in that place. No family, no one to protect you." "No, sir," Caleb whispered. "And yet, you protected my daughter." The chief's voice was not questioning. It was filled with a kind of resonant wonder. "Why?" Caleb looked up, finally meeting the man's intense gaze. He thought for a moment, searching for a grand, heroic reason, But there was none. There was only the simple, unvarnished truth. "She was in the way," he said, his voice cracking with earnestness. "The horses were coming. I could move. She couldn't. It just happened." Chayton held his gaze for another long moment, and for the first time, Caleb saw something in the chief's eyes soften. It was not pity, but a flicker of profound respect. The chief gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned and left the lodge without another word. From that day on, something shifted. The watchfulness in Chayton's eyes was still there, but it was now tempered with something else, something Caleb did not dare to name. It felt like the barest seedling of acceptance. Weeks turned into a month. Caleb could stand, leaning heavily on a crutch Winona had fashioned for him. He hobbled out of the lodge for the first time into the bright, crisp air of the plains. The Lakota people regarded him with curiosity, but not hostility. They had all heard the story. He was Wanbli-Kat, the one who was killed by an eagle, a name they had given him that was not quite right, for he had been trampled by horses, but it spoke to the spirit of his sacrifice. He was the white boy who had given himself up for their chief's daughter. He began to heal in spirit as well as body. The constant gnawing loneliness in his gut began to ease, replaced by the quiet hum of community around him. He learned to say a few words in their language. Lila Pilamaya for thank you very much, which he said often to Istus and Winona. He watched the craftsmen and learned how they fletched arrows with hawk feathers. He listened to the stories the elders told around the evening fire, tales of the Great Spirit, the buffalo, and the stars. For the first time since his parents' death, he felt like he was a part of something larger than his own small, miserable existence. He was beginning to feel a sense of home, a concept he had long since abandoned. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. News traveled on the wind, and the wind eventually blew back to Redemption Creek. The story of the orphan boy's disappearance had morphed into something ugly and twisted. The prospectors, led by a particularly brutish man named Vance, had covered their own guilt by spreading a new tale. The savage Lakota had abducted the boy and now held him captive. It was a lie born of cowardice, but it found fertile ground in the prejudiced hearts of the townsfolk. One afternoon, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It was not a hunting party. It was a group of riders from the town, and they rode with a grim, aggressive purpose. Chayton's camp grew quiet, the air suddenly thick with tension. Warriors picked up their bows and rifles, their faces stoic and ready. Winona hurried to Caleb's side, her hand resting on his arm, her knuckles white. Vance and a dozen other men reined in their horses just outside the camp's perimeter. Their faces were flushed with whiskey and self-righteousness. Vance, a big man with a cruel mouth, acted as their spokesman. "We've come for the boy," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the silent space. "We know you have him. Release him to us." Chayton stepped forward, unarmed, his posture radiating an unshakable authority. "The boy is not a prisoner," he stated, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of steel. "He is a guest. He is healing." "That's a lie," another man shouted. "You savages stole him. We've come to take him back to his own kind." Caleb watched from beside the chief's lodge, his heart pounding against his bruised ribs. His own kind. The words were a bitter irony. His kind had left him to starve. His kind had nearly killed him. These people, these savages, had nursed him back from the brink of death. The standoff was a taut wire, ready to snap. Vance's men grew bolder, their hands inching toward the pistols at their belts. They saw the Lakota's restraint as weakness. The warriors in the camp tensed, their knuckles white on their weapons, waiting for a single word from their chief. It was then that Caleb made his choice. Leaning heavily on his crutch, he began to walk forward, his steps slow and deliberate. Every movement sent a jolt of pain up his leg, but he ignored it. Winona made a move to stop him, but a glance from her father stilled her. All eyes, Lakota and white, fell upon the thin, limping boy. He stopped a few feet from Chayton, placing himself between the two groups. He looked directly at Vance, his blue eyes clear and steady, all traces of the frightened, invisible orphan burned away. "You didn't come to save me," Caleb said, his voice surprisingly strong, carrying in the tense silence. "You came to save yourselves." Vance's face darkened. "What are you talking about, boy? They've twisted your mind." "My mind is clearer than it's ever been," Caleb retorted, his voice rising with a strength born of pure conviction. "I remember everything. I remember you, Vance. You and your friends, drunk and reckless, racing your horses like fools. You never even saw her. You would have ridden her down without a second thought." A murmur went through Vance's men. A few of them had the decency to look away, their bluster fading in the face of the boy's stark accusation. Caleb pointed a trembling finger at them. "You left me in the dirt to die. You ran like cowards." "I have no people in that town," he said, the words tearing from a place of deep, long-buried pain. "The only people who treated me with any kindness are right here." He gestured with his crutch to the silent Lakota around him. "These people, they took me in. They healed me. They saved my life after you tried to end it." He turned his back on the men from town, a gesture of finality, and looked at Chayton. "I am not your prisoner," he said, his voice dropping, now meant only for the chief and those nearby. "But I will not go back with them. My place is not there." The courage of the act hung in the air. A crippled, orphaned boy had stood before a dozen armed men and spoken a truth they could not refute. Vance, his face a mask of purple rage and humiliation, was rendered speechless. He had come expecting to play the hero, to rescue a captive. Instead, he had been exposed as a liar and a coward by his intended victim. Chayton stepped forward, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. The gesture was both protective and proprietary. He looked at Vance, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones in winter. "You have heard the boy," the chief said, his voice low and dangerous. "He has made his choice. You are not welcome here. Leave now, before your presence becomes an insult my people are no longer willing to bear." The threat was unmistakable. Vance looked from Chayton's unyielding face to the grim warriors fanned out across the camp. The whiskey-fueled courage had evaporated, leaving only the sour dregs of fear. Without another word, he wrenched his horse's reins, turned, and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow in a disordered and shameful retreat. As the dust of their departure settled, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the camp. The tension broke. Winona rushed to Caleb's side, her eyes shining with unshed tears of pride and relief. Caleb felt his legs begin to tremble, the adrenaline that had sustained him suddenly draining away, leaving him weak and shaking. Chayton's hand remained firm on his shoulder, holding him steady. "You have the heart of a warrior, Caleb," the chief said quietly, "a heart of truth." That evening, the mood in the camp was lighter than it had been in weeks. The threat had been faced and turned away, not by violence, but by the courage of one boy and the strength of a united people. Caleb sat by the central fire, wrapped in a warm buffalo robe, watching the flames dance. The pain in his leg was a dull ache, but the ache in his soul, the one he had carried for so long, was almost gone. Later, after most of the camp had retired to their lodges, Chayton came and sat beside him. For a long time they sat in a comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer about assessment, but about companionship. The vast, star-dusted sky arched over them, immense and peaceful. "My own son," Chayton began, his voice soft and reflective, "was taken from us by the white man's sickness 4 winters ago. He had a strong spirit. He was brave, but his body was not strong enough. When he died, a part of my own spirit died with him. I asked the Great Spirit why he would leave such a hole in my heart, in my family." Caleb listened, his own heart aching in sympathy. He said nothing, sensing that this was a story that needed to be told without interruption. "In our way," Chayton continued, turning his profound gaze upon Caleb, "we believe that a life saved belongs to the one who saved it. By that law, Winona's life would belong to you. But you did more than that. You offered your own life in its place. You gave everything you had for her, a stranger. The Great Spirit works in ways we do not always understand. I believe he did not take my son forever. I believe he has now sent me another." Chayton reached out and placed his hand on the back of Caleb's neck, his touch firm and warm. The gesture was so deeply paternal, so full of meaning, that it shattered the last of Caleb's defenses. "Your life no longer belongs in the dust of that town," the chief said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your life now belongs with us. Your spirit is Lakota. I would be honored to call you son." The word hung in the cool night air. Son. It was a word Caleb never thought he would hear again. It was a home. It was a family. It was the healing of the deepest wound he carried. Tears he had refused to shed for 2 long years finally brimmed and spilled over, tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He couldn't speak. He could only nod, a convulsive, desperate movement of acceptance. Chayton pulled the boy into a firm embrace, holding the thin, scarred body of his new son against his own. For Caleb, it was not the end of his pain or the forgetting of his past. It was something far more profound. It was the discovery that a family was not just something you were born into, but something that could find you, broken and alone, and call you home. Under the watchful eyes of the prairie stars, the orphan boy from Redemption Creek finally found his people. He had a father, he had a sister, he had a place. And for the first time in his life, he was truly, completely home.